I decided I wanted to teach on the book of Exodus. I've talked about stories from Exodus across the years in sermons, and when I've done a run through the whole Bible and Old Testament things, I've, of course, talked about some of the stories in Exodus, but I really want to do a thorough look at the book of Exodus over the next several weeks, because, not just my opinion, scholars would tell us that in terms of the Old Testament, Exodus is the most significant book in the Old Testament. Exodus is the most significant book in the Old Testament. And when I think about the events of Exodus, the Exodus itself, the Passover, all that goes with that, when you think about us as Christians, for us, our central event is Easter Sunday. Our central focus of all that we are, if there's one historical event, if there's one Bible story that is the focus of our faith as Christians, it's the resurrection. It's Easter. If there is one event that is the focus of Judaism, if there's one event in the Old Testament that is the focus of the Jewish faith and the Jewish heritage, and that they only could have one book in the Old Testament, it would be Exodus. Because the Exodus and the Passover is at the very heart of Judaism, of the identity of Judaism. And because of that, how we, the Bible talks about, if it pictures Israel as an olive tree, and it says we, Christians, are like branches that have been grafted onto that tree. We are part of that same heritage of the children of Abraham. There's a reason that we have both an Old Testament and the New Testament. There's a reason that we continue to preach from the Old Testament, not just the New Testament. There's a reason that those stories that go back from Genesis all the way through the 39 books of the Old Testament, there's a reason that we continue to read from those and study those, and because the children of Abraham is the story of the Old Testament. And Jesus is born into that family and into that culture and into the prophecies of that culture. And his sacrifice on Calvary, his blood shed on Calvary, is an echo of what happens on the Passover with the Passover lamb, with the blood of the lamb that's shed as part of the Passover celebration. It all connects. And so the book of Exodus is the linchpin of the Old Testament. So having said that, before I get to Exodus chapter 1, I feel like I need for all of us just to have a brief recap of what happens before that in Genesis. Now, I'm not going to, there's 50 chapters in Genesis, and believe me, I'm going to try to do this in just maybe 10 minutes of recap of what's happening in Genesis. But like everything else, you can't fully understand the beginning of Exodus without an understanding of what comes before. Now, Genesis, we have these stories at the beginning of Genesis of the creation, of the Garden of Eden, of the Tower of Babel, of the Ark and Noah and all that. Those stories, we say, when did those occur? Well, they're not in any particular historical context, and some would say they are what we would call prehistory. Some would say they're not even meant to be history as much as they're meant to be parables about the beginnings of humanity. But so when we get to chapter 12, though, of Genesis, we begin the story of the family of Abraham. And it's the story of the family of Abraham and the descendants of Abraham that carries us all the way through the entire Old Testament. The entire Old Testament is about the family of Abraham. And so you get to chapter 12 of Genesis, and we meet this person that actually there, his name is Abram, which means exalted father. It is later in Genesis that his name is changed from Abram to Abraham, which is a slightly different Hebrew word. Instead of exalted father, it is father of a multitude. When we first meet Abram, he's not a father at all. He's an older man with an older wife, and they are childless. His wife, Sarah, which means princess, has never been able to have children. And so we meet this man, Abram, there in chapter 12 of Genesis, and he is living in a place called Ur. And scholars are not exactly sure where Ur was. The consensus of scholars is that it's Iraq. because there is a place in Iraq that has a similar name, and it seems to be, archaeologists and scholars seem to think that's where Ur was. But God speaks to Abram and says, Abram, leave everything. Leave everything you know, your nation, everything. And you need to follow me and go to a land that I will show you. He doesn't tell him exactly where that land is. He just says, go to a land I'll show you. And he says, and I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. And it says, Abram believed God, and God counted it to him as righteousness. It was Abraham's faith and trust in God that made God declare him righteous. And so we follow Abram, and he has trials and tribulations, and his wife Sarah has no child still, and for several years he keeps saying, well, when's this child going to happen? And God doesn't seem to give him a timeline. He gets desperate at one point. Sarah says, I'm never going to have a baby. Sleep with my maid, and that child will count as your child. And he does that. He sleeps with his maid Hagar. A child is born, Ishmael. And God says, I'm going to bless your descendants. And Abram says, yes, bless Ishmael. And God says, okay, I will, but that's not who I'm talking about. I'm not talking about Ishmael. He says, you're still going to have a child with Sarah, which she's well beyond the years of childbearing age, but she does. She has this baby, Isaac, Yitzhak in the Hebrew. That word in Hebrew means laughter, because when you're a 90-year-old woman and you have a baby, you either laugh or cry, I guess, and so they named the little boy Isaac, Yitzhak, laughter. And this is the beginning of the children of Abraham. He has one son with his wife and one son with his maid. And the whole story of Ishmael, it goes in a different direction. Our friends, our Muslim friends, follow that part of Abraham's lineage. The Quran follows Ishmael. In the Quran, the stories that we attribute to Isaac, our Muslim friends attribute those to Ishmael. The story that when Abraham almost sacrifices Isaac until the last minute, God says, no, don't do it. I was just making sure you really trusted me. In the Quran, it is Ishmael, not Isaac, in that story. So when we talk about Abraham, we talk about Abraham being the patriarch of three religions: Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Abraham is the patriarch of all three of those monotheistic faiths. Monotheistic meaning one God, as opposed to polytheistic religions that believe in a whole pantheon of gods, which was the norm in the ancient world. The norm in the ancient world was a pantheon of gods: a god of the sky, a god of the moon, a god of the sun, a god of the rain, a god of the harvest, a god of the this, and a god of the that. That was the norm in the ancient world. Even people who are atheists, even people who don't believe in any kind of religion whatsoever, still say it is Judaism that brings the whole idea of monotheism, one God, to the world. That has its heritage, the whole idea that instead of there being a whole bunch of gods, there's just one. That begins with Judaism. That begins with the children of Abraham. So Abraham has this one son, Isaac. Isaac eventually marries Rebekah. Rebekah and Isaac have twin boys, Esau and Jacob. They are total opposites, like a lot of twins. Esau is a hunter and an outdoorsman, and Isaac is, as they say, a man of the tents, but he is a schemer and a planner, and the two of them are always at odds with each other. And we know Jacob, he's the younger by minutes because they're twins, but he's the younger. He tricks his brother into selling him the birthright, the right of the eldest son, for a bowl of stew. And Jacob's name means grabber, usurper, and that's his personality. And we read about Jacob's trials and tribulations and how he steals from his brother, and his brother says, I'm going to kill you. And Jacob has to flee to get away from his brother before his brother Esau can kill him. And Jacob flees to go live with his uncle, his mother's brother, Laban, who is also a schemer and kind of a tricky fellow. And they try to outwit each other. Jacob marries two of his uncle's daughters. First he marries Leah, the one he doesn't want to marry, by trickery. Then he marries Rachel, the one he does want to marry. They get into a contest of who can have the most babies. They bring their maids into it so they can have even more babies. And long story short, Jacob ends up with children by 4 different women: Rachel, Leah, and their maids. And that ends up having 12 sons. So Jacob has 12 sons. And he finally, his family gets so big that he decides he's going to leave his uncle. And he also finds out his brother, his twin brother, after all these years, is going to come and still kill him. And he's ready to face his brother and ready to die. But his brother Esau decides, instead of going to war with him, decides to make peace with him. They part frenemies. And Jacob, in the meantime, with his scheming and his plotting, wrestles with God, and God changes his name after a wrestling match. He changes Jacob's name to Israel, which means wrestle with God. Which you think about over the thousands of years since that happened, and whenever we hear about the nation of Israel, that name is appropriate. The name Israel means wrestle with God. So that brings us up to these 12 sons by these 4 different women, but the 2 of them are born of his favorite wife, Rachel, and that's Joseph and Benjamin. They're the 2 favorite sons. Joseph and Benjamin are the 2 favorite boys. They're the 2 youngest. And Jacob, aka Israel, loves those 2 boys more than the other 10 because they're from his favorite wife. He loves Joseph and Benjamin the most. And because of that, the favoritism he shows to them, the other 10 brothers are jealous. And as you know, they decide to sell their brother Joseph into slavery. They throw him in a well, sell him to some traders with a D, and the traders take Joseph as a slave and sell him into slavery in Egypt. And we read from chapter 37 through chapter 50 of Genesis, we read the story of Joseph. Joseph is a bright young man, but he gets accused of trying to rape the wife of his master, which he doesn't do. She's trying to seduce him, but he gets accused of that, gets thrown into jail. But he has a gift of dream interpretation. And a famine is about to hit the land, not just Egypt, but the whole Middle East. And the Pharaoh of Egypt is having crazy dreams that are foretelling this famine. None of his viziers and wise men can interpret this dream. But one of his men, his butler, who was also in jail with Joseph for displeasing the Pharaoh, he says, there's a guy down there that told me what my dreams meant, and he was right. They yank Joseph out of jail. He interprets the Pharaoh's dreams about there's going to be 7 years of bountiful harvests followed by 7 years of horrible famine. And Joseph says to Pharaoh, you need to get somebody in charge of a big food program to fill up the silos with grain to prepare for the famine. And Pharaoh says, well, you're a bright young man. How about you? And Joseph becomes in charge of the food program in Egypt. And rises to a high position in Egyptian government. Meanwhile, his father and brothers and their families are all starving in Canaan. So they go to Egypt to try to buy food. There's a series of tests and intrigue, and I won't go into all that, but the bottom line is Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. They think, well, he's going to kill us now because we sold him into slavery. He says, no, what you meant for evil, God meant for good, to rescue us from this famine. And he saves his brothers and his family and his father and everybody from the famine. And here's the of all that to get to that point. Here's the crucial piece that leads us into Exodus. Joseph has risen to this high place in the Egyptian government. He's been put in charge of this food program. He has won the respect and admiration of the Pharaoh. Famine is all over the land, and only Egypt has food because of the wisdom of storing up the grain for the 7 good years. So Pharaoh says to Joseph, bring your family to Egypt where they can have food. And so Joseph and his brothers and their father and the wives and the kids, the whole clan, which is about 70 people, they all move to Egypt. And they move to a region of Egypt called Goshen. And if you've ever seen a really old movie, occasionally, especially a Western, an expression that is long dead, but sometimes some old timer will go, well, land of Goshen. Well, land of Goshen is a reference to the fact that that's where they settled in Egypt, in the land of Goshen. Okay? And that is where the book of Genesis ends. The book of Genesis ends with this family, which is now Abraham's grandchildren. Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob. Well, actually his great-grandchildren. So Abraham's great-grandchildren, these 12 sons of Jacob, and their wives and their children, all of this family of 70 people, the descendants of Abraham, all moving to Egypt. And that's where Genesis ends, with all the descendants of all the family of Abraham moving to Egypt. Thus ends Genesis. We turn the page to Exodus, and it's 400 years later. Okay? So, and I say if it were a movie, well, they've made movies about this stuff, but if it was a movie, and you see here's the family moving into Egypt, and they're all happy, and they're honored guests of the Pharaoh loves this family because of what Joseph has done to save them from famine, and everybody's happy, and everybody's welcome, and everybody's an honored visitor and guest, then the movie would have the scene, it would say, 400 years later. And you turn the page, and that's Exodus. So I say all that, and I took that time because unless you understand all of that, Exodus doesn't make as much sense. Exodus is about the ongoing saga of the descendants of Abraham. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, etc. And of course, those 12 sons that Jacob has from the 4 different women become the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 tribes of Israel are the names of those 12 sons that Jacob has by the 4 women. Now, if you have your Bible, open it to Exodus 1:1. It's interesting. The name of Exodus is the English and Latin and Greek name of this book. The Hebrew name of this book is, let me make sure I say it right. The Hebrew name of this book is Shemot, which means names. And why is it called names? Because in Hebrew, they usually just take one of the first words of the first sentence, and that's the name of the book. Because the book of Exodus starts, these are the names. So that's the name of the book in Hebrew, the book of names, which isn't very descriptive of what the story is going to lead us to. The word Exodus, which of course is like related to our word exit, leaving, is a more descriptive. But the Hebrew name just is, this is the book of names. And you read the very beginning, and this is where the bridge between Genesis and Exodus is. These are the names, this is Exodus 1:1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. That's 11. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Joseph makes 12. Okay, so we're told these are the 12 brothers and their children, which total 70 people, all move to Egypt. Verse 6, now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. We know that this family was primarily shepherds. You know, when you read about in Genesis about Jacob and his sons, they're out tending the sheep, they're out in the fields. Well, you know, the Holy Land is not known for having big, giant patches of green. It's mainly known for having big, great patches of rock. The grass is not plentiful in that part of the world. And so being a shepherd and raising sheep, you have to constantly be looking for water and constantly looking for greenery. Well, Goshen was supposed to be a fairly lush part of Egypt. That's why Pharaoh gave it to him, where the living was a little easier, the work was a little easier, and where they started having lots of kids, and their kids started having lots of kids. And you start doing the math. Well, okay, we start with 70 people, and they all, you know, are marrying first and second cousins, and they're having big families, and they're having big families, and I've never run the math, but in 400 years, they grow to a very large population. In 400, I mean, 400 years, think about it just in our time. How long ago was 400 years ago? You know, well, okay, let's do the math on that. It's 2024, so 1624 would be 400 years ago. I mean, you know, the Pilgrims were barely here. You know, they come in 1620. So 1624, 400 years ago, we think of that as an enormous amount of time. You know, the time of the Pilgrims, that's an enormous long time ago. That's how long we're talking about when we're talking about the difference between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. The population of the descendants of Abraham grows significantly. And as we're going to see later on when it starts telling us about how many people actually leave Egypt, it's a huge number. It's a big, big number. So this family, this ethnic group grows significantly. And it says in verse 8, then a new king who didn't know about Joseph came to power in Egypt. Now, of course, we would know by king, they're talking about a Pharaoh. And what we don't know, you know, as to at what point in the story do the children of Abraham and the descendants of Jacob, what point do they go from welcome guests and favored people to immigrants that are viewed with great suspicion, and they're not pure Egyptians, and they're not like us, and they're ethnically different, and they're Semites, which Egyptians are not? At what point does the Pharaoh know nothing about ancient history of 400 years ago? Now, you know, think about it. Most people are illiterate, and books are scarce, and, I mean, that they would forget about Joseph and his wonderful deeds that he did for Egypt 400 years ago is not surprising. Excuse me, I'm going to cough for just a second. So a new Pharaoh does not remember or know about the great Joseph and all he did for the Egyptians. And it says, look, this is verse 9. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they'll become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So this group of Israelites has never really assimilated into the Egyptian population. They've remained separate from the Egyptian population. So they're viewed now with suspicion. Are they loyal to Pharaoh? Are they loyal to Egypt? Or if there was to be a war, would they fight for us? Or would they fight against us? Where do their loyalties lie? They begin to question this people. And they decide they need to keep them down. So, verse 11, they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with hard labor and brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their hard labor, the Egyptians used them ruthlessly. So they put them to slave labor. And thinking, well, if we work them hard enough, their birth rate will slow down. But that didn't work. And so, well, just work them harder. And we'll keep working them harder and harder, but that doesn't work. And so they keep treating them more and more cruelly. So now they think, these people are really a threat to our national security. These people are a threat to our ability to trust them. So, verse 15, the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, which, as scholars point out, we're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of people. There's probably more than two midwives. I mean, there would be a lot of babies to cover with just two midwives. So these are maybe representative midwives of the other women who helped deliver babies. When you help the Hebrew women in childbirth and observe them on the delivery stool, if it's a boy, kill him. If it's a girl, let her live. I'm like, well, we can't imagine the girls growing up and fighting against us, but, there's just too many males who could potentially fight against us. So we're going to thin out the male population. So they order the midwives to kill, if it's a baby boy, to kill it. But these midwives are not going to do that. They're not going to murder little baby boys. The midwives, verse 17, however, feared God and didn't do what the king of Egypt had told them to do and let the boys live. So they're not killing the baby boys. The king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? The midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They're vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. Now, somebody pointed out enough, this is one of those things that I was reading one account and talking about this, that said, this is almost probably a lie. The midwives are lying to Pharaoh. Those babies come so quick, and by the time we get there, those babies, they're out working in the fields, they're just, we can't get there quick enough. Almost certainly this is a lie. The reason this commentary brought it up, it was like the right of enslaved and oppressed people to lie to their oppressors. because it said this was pointing, it was saying, we in Christianity, we've tended to say lying is always wrong. And in general, lying is wrong. But they point out there are occasions where someone is being enslaved or oppressed or tortured or something else when you can justify an oppressed person not being honest with their tormentor or their oppressor. And most of you all know, before I went to seminary, I have a philosophy degree from OU. And these are the kind of things you talk about in philosophy classes, when is it justified to not always be truthful? And the classic example that's always brought up when this is discussed is, okay, World War II, Poland, wherever, Germany, a righteous couple is hiding Jews in their attic to hide them from the Nazis so the Nazis won't take them to the ovens of Buchenwald or Auschwitz. Righteous people are hiding Jews in their attic. And the Nazis come knocking at the door. Are you hiding any Jews? The righteous thing to do is to lie, 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 they would say. In that occasion, to save a life against evil, then a lie is justified. Now, you gotta be careful when you even tell that story, especially to a child. Like, oh, lying's okay? Well, no. But there are times when one good supersedes another good. Being truthful is always a good thing. Fighting evil and saving innocent lives is even a more important thing. So, that's where you talk about the hierarchy of morality, the hierarchy of morals here. So they say, no, we can't kill those babies. So, because they are not killing the baby boys, verse 20, God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: every boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. All right. So they're saying, okay, if the midwives aren't going to strangle them at birth, we're going to order when a baby boy is born, he's to be tossed into the Nile. Now, we'll talk more about this, but the Nile is the mother river of Egypt. The Nile is holy for the Egyptian religion. The Nile is sacred. And so we're going to throw the babies into the Nile. So that sets up the story of the protagonist of the book of Exodus, the hero of the story at chapter 2. A man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and right off the bat, we're like, what do you mean Levite? Well, remember, we got 12 sons of Jacob, and those are the 12 tribes within the larger country of the Israelites, the children of Abraham. One of those 12 sons was Levi. So if you are descended from that brother of the 12 brothers, if you're descended from the brother Levi, you're a Levite. And that becomes an important part of the story as we go down through the Old Testament, the 12 tribes of Israel. The Levites, just, spoiler alert, the Levites are going to be particularly important as the priestly tribe. The tribe that all the priests come from is going to be the tribe of Levi. So this is Moses' tribe, the priestly tribe. So 2 Levites get married, and it says she became pregnant, she gave birth to a son, and she saw that he was a fine child. She hid him for 3 months. Knowing that if they see a little baby boy, the Egyptian guards, the Egyptian soldiers, the Egyptians would see a baby boy of a Hebrew child and say, put him in the river, throw him in the Nile. So she hides him. She's able to hide him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. And she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. And his sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. And this, of course, is the very well-known story. Little baby Moses is put in a basket. his mother obeys the letter of the law. You got to put him in the Nile. Okay, she put him in the Nile. In a basket, though. Didn't just toss him in there, places him in there near the shoreline, among the reeds. And his sister is Miriam, we're going to find out her name is. Sister is watching just to see what will happen. And what her plan, we're never told, well, the mother's plan was X. We're never really told. Did she have any idea of what might happen or could happen? But we do know what does happen. Pharaoh's daughter comes along. Verse 5, Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank, and she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to get it. And she opened it up and saw a baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of those Hebrew babies, she said. So the daughter of Pharaoh, seeing this little baby infant, 3-month-old baby boy in a basket in the river, her heart goes out, because it's one thing to issue a general order, kill all the baby boys. It's another to see one up close and personal crying. So as she's looking at the baby and her wheels are turning, verse 7, his sister, Moses' sister, asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" Because, of course, Pharaoh's daughter was not going to be able to nurse the baby. And she's like, "Oh, well, yeah, that's a great idea." She said, "Yes, go." She answered, and the girl went and got the baby's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take the baby and nurse him for me, and I'll pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. Now, of course, you smile at this, because now not only has she saved her child, she's getting paid to nurse her own baby by the Pharaoh's daughter. The Pharaoh's daughter is now going to pay her to nurse her baby. And in that part of the world, then, and in some cases now, nursing goes a lot longer than it does for most American babies. The average age of weaning a baby is 3 years. So babies are usually wet nursed, breastfed until they're 3, which is quite a bit longer than in our culture. Sometimes they said occasionally even up to age 5, which sounds, kind of crazy to us. But so that means that this baby that Moses' mother is nursing grows up in 2 households. He grows up in his natural household with his own mother and sister, etc. He also grows up in the household of Pharaoh. And once he's weaned, when he's 3 or 4 years old, then he is raised as part of a royal family. Now, I don't know how many of y'all have seen the movie Prince of Egypt, the animated movie Prince of Egypt, which Janine was telling me to tell you all, if you have Netflix, it's on Netflix right now. Prince of Egypt is on Netflix. DreamWorks put it together, and it's, a movie now that's, I don't know, more than 25 years old, I think. I still think it's one of the best versions of the Moses story of any, live action or animated. It's really, I think, beautifully done. And like any movie, they take some liberties with things, but I think the way they handle it, and I know they had, when they put the movie together, Prince of Egypt, they consulted Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars in all 3 when putting the movie together. And I know the scene, they give some drama in that. The basket is kind of going down some waterfalls and escaping crocodiles and things like that, which it doesn't say that in the Bible. But they had to add a little bit of, that kind of stuff to the movie. But it really is a beautifully done version of the story. So he grows up, and once he's weaned, he grows up, as that movie would call it, as a prince of Egypt. When the child grew older, verse 10, she took him, Pharaoh's daughter, took him to, she, meaning Moses' natural mother, took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, or in Hebrew, Moishe. She named him Moishe, saying, I drew him out of the water. And Moshe in Hebrew sounds a lot like the Hebrew word for to draw out. So that's probably, in some ways a pun. Other scholars say, no, she named him Moses because of an Egyptian word that sounds more like that same idea of taking something out or pulling something out. So whether it's based on an Egyptian word or a Hebrew word, there's arguments about that. Excuse me. Okay, so now we turn to a few verses, or next verse, and he's all grown up. Okay, so, much like Jesus, we read about the Christmas story. We read one story when he's 12, and then he's 30 years old. I mean, we don't have a whole lot in between. Well, here with Moses, we know when he's weaned, and now he's a grown man in verse 11. And he's grown up in the court. And so he has grown up undoubtedly now, I say, a man of two cultures, or a boy of two cultures. He understands his mother and sister have undoubtedly told him his true origins. He's also grown up speaking Egyptian, learning Egyptian teachings and Egyptian mythology and Egyptian theology, and being taught as a prince, probably military parts of Egyptian. He dresses like an Egyptian, undoubtedly. He looks like an Egyptian in terms of how he dresses, and probably right down to the eye makeup and everything else. So he is a man of two worlds, a young man of two worlds. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Glancing this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So, we're picturing these Hebrew slaves. If they don't work hard enough, there's probably a whip or some other kind of instrument to punish them for laying down on the job, beating them, whatever. And Moses observes an Egyptian overseer, taskmaster, beating a Hebrew slave, probably somewhat viciously and maliciously, and he gets angry and somewhat rashly kills the Egyptian. After looking around to make sure nobody has seen him, buries the body, and then goes about his business. But it does not go unknown. The next day, verse 13, he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? You thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" So it did not go. Somebody did see. Somebody did know. And the rumor went around that he had killed an Egyptian. And these two Hebrews look at him in his Egyptian garb of probably wealth and are somewhat resentful. Like, who told you you could, are you on our side or on their side? Where do you stand? Are you going to kill me too? And Moses realizes, Moses was afraid and thought, what I did must have become known. And then it says, when Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. So, and again, there's so many questions that we would wonder about. Pharaoh's daughter has adopted this Hebrew baby. Surely the Pharaoh had mixed feelings about that. Surely he also thought, where do his true loyalties lie? There's all kinds of questions we would ask about just how Egyptianized was he, and just how much was he in touch with his roots and his own family. And we're not really told any of that. We just know that when he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, it makes him angry. So he's got, obviously, in touch with his own roots. And Pharaoh, probably this may be what it takes for him to realize he's not loyal to us at all. He's not one of us. And so he decides this is an opportunity to kill him. Now, whether this is the same Pharaoh who is the father of his adopted mother, again, the author's not terribly concerned with the names of the pharaohs. We believe, historians believe, based on the story and based on the timeline, The Pharaoh of the story is probably Ramesses II, also known as Ramesses the Great. That is the Pharaoh in this story. But he's never named. They never call him Ramesses. Somebody pointed out, they never mention the name of the Pharaoh. They never mention the name of the daughter. They mention the midwives' names, but they never mention the name of the Pharaoh or his daughter. But the Pharaoh becomes aware of Moses' crime. When Pharaoh heard this, verse 15, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, which is the sticks, which is the boonies. As in a Midianite, he went to live in Midian. And then immediately now he's in Midian. It says he sat down by a well. Now, a priest of Midian, and a priest of Midian would not be a worshiper necessarily of the Hebrew people or the children of Abraham. He is a local priest of the Midianites. He had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. It was common in those days that young girls, until they reached really womanhood, often were shepherdesses. But some male shepherds came along and drove them away. Why? Because water is a scarce commodity. Water is not plentiful. Sometimes lots of fights would arise over water rights and who could access the wells. And so some men come along to chase these women, shepherdesses, away. But Moses gets up and comes to their rescue. It says, Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. So Moses now is in Midian, and he is on the side of these young women. It says when the girls returned to Reuel, their father, they asked him, "Why have you returned so early?" Because I guess usually they would have to either wait for the men to finish, or they come back surprisingly early. They answered, "An Egyptian rescued us." Notice, why would she assume he's an Egyptian? Because of how he's dressed. He's dressed as an Egyptian. He may be speaking Egyptian, which would be the language he would have been speaking almost all the time. An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock. "And where is he?" He asked his daughters. "Why'd you leave him? Have him come, invite him to have something to eat." Because as I've mentioned multiple times in multiple things, in the Middle East, then and now, hospitality is a sacred obligation. And especially if somebody had helped your daughters, you better invite them for a meal. You better welcome them in, because hospitality is expected and a high priority, hospitality. So he says, "Well, go bring him." So Moses agreed to stay with the man, and again, we're not sure, fast forward, who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Probably not that day. I mean, hopefully. Again, timelines get compressed. He kills an Egyptian, he flees, he gets to Midian, he drives off some shepherds, he meets some girls, and then marries one of them. And that all happens in the space of about 4 verses. Probably didn't all happen, maybe all in the same day. But, we're just told this happened and this happened. So he ends up marrying one of the daughters of this priest of Midian, a Midianite woman named Zipporah. And then next verse, well, she's got a baby. I mean, again, so, we're jumping forward at least 9 months now. She has a son with Moses, and Moses named him Gershom, which he says, saying, "I have become an alien in a foreign land." Gershom in Hebrew sounds a lot like the word for alien. Hebrew names are often puns, or they actually mean something. They actually mean they mean something like God. My God is Yahweh, or something like that. Elijah. Eli means God. Jah is like Yahweh. So Elijah means Yahweh is my God. His name means that. And that's often names, actually mean something. Now, if you go into some of these stores, they'll say, oh, this is what your name means. Well, sometimes, yeah, sometimes. Supposedly, my name, which is Lawrence, of course, actually, Lawrence means laurel, like the leaves that they'd put on the athletes in the Olympics. That's what my name means. And most of y'all, if you looked up your name, you'd figure out it means something, although a lot of people, we don't choose names often based on that. But in Hebrew, it's very important that the name often means something about even the name of the child at birth. Going back to Jacob and Esau, Esau means hairy because he was a hairy baby. Jacob means grabber because it said he was holding on to Esau's ankle when he came out of the womb. So sometimes the name of a person is based even on something from their birth. How would you like to name your baby Harry? I don't know, but anyway, H-A-I-R-Y. So he names his son basically Alien because he's there in the middle of Midian. During that long period, the king of Egypt died, and the Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out. Now, when I say Ramesses II is the Pharaoh that we're going to meet next. The one it's Ramesses I is the one that just died, and Ramesses II is the one that Moses is going to have the battle of wills with. So, during that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. And we might go, well, did God forget about them for 400 years? It doesn't really say that. And often in Hebrew language, it seems to imply like, well, God doesn't really forget things. He had to be reminded of things. But from the author's perspective, hadn't heard much from God since the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, anytime I read that, the Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out for help, you realize that in our country, during the horrible time of slavery here, many of the songs and spirituals and hymns, of African Americans were about Moses. Let my people go. And the songs were at least ostensibly about the Hebrew children and Pharaoh, but of course they were also often really about what was happening then and there in America during the horrible time of slavery. And you kind of think, if you were a slave owner in the 1800s in America, and you're in church and you're reading about Moses and Pharaoh and the Hebrew children crying out in their slavery and bondage, would you not ever connect the dots? Would you not ever say, this makes it sound like slavery's kind of a bad thing? I don't know how, we can all have our blindness, but it's right there. It's right there. Slavery's not a good thing. And people cry out to God, get us out of this bondage, get us out of this slavery. God looked on them and was concerned about them because they groaned in their bondage and in their slavery. So that leads us now. Moses is out there in the middle of nowhere in Midian. He's married to a Midianite woman. He's already had a son by the Midianite woman. His time as a prince of Egypt now is farther and farther and farther in the rearview mirror. It's like a whole nother life. He's now settled into, I'm a living here. I'm a shepherd in the middle of nowhere. I'm still a stranger. He's probably had long since stopped wearing his Egyptian robes and started wearing clothes like the people that he's now living with. The whole time in Egypt is undoubtedly now getting more and more distant in his mind until now in chapter 3. Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, We would go, oh, wait a minute, I thought his name was Raul. Well, he has two different names in the story. And why he has two different names, a lot of people have more than one name, but he's referred to by both of those names. It's not a different guy. I think we're to understand that Reuel and Jethro are the same guy, who is his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And as a matter of fact, this coming Sunday, I'm going to talk about a disciple who was known by multiple names. So Jethro and Reuel are the same guy. Jethro, not to be confused with the guy from Beverly Hillbillies. So those of you who know that show. Although that's where Jethro's name, of course, comes from in Beverly Hillbillies. He's named after this guy in the Bible. He's tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. He led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord, and I've said this multiple times, but just a reminder, in your Bible, when you come to that word Lord, you'll see it in all caps. You'll see the word Lord often in a different little font, and it'll be all caps, Lord. That's because in English Bibles, anytime you see Lord like that, it is Yahweh. It is the name of God, Yahweh. Now, that's the more recent understanding by scholars of how to pronounce it. For centuries, we thought you pronounced it Jehovah. And we thought, well, that's how you pronounce this word, is Jehovah. But our understanding of ancient Hebrew has increased, and I believe the scholars and the ones that I went to school with and things like that, mainly because the Hebrew alphabet has no vowels. I've mentioned that before. Hebrew is an alphabet and a language with only consonants, no vowels. You have to supply the vowels in your brain. And I don't have a whiteboard behind me. I'll try to maybe have one next week. But you think about it. If we, in context, we could understand writing without the vowels. If we wrote, the fox jumped over the dog, and you take out all the vowels, and you have just TH, FX, JMPD, VR, TH, DG, you would still be able to figure out that says the fox jumped over the dog, even without the vowels. Because in context, it would make sense. Is that dog or is it dig? Is that fox or is it fax? Well, in context, you know what it is. And this is the same way with Hebrew. You can read it without the vowels. And so there are no vowels in Hebrew. And that's when I took Hebrew in seminary, I'm like, what do you mean there's no vowels? It's hard enough that you read it from right to left and that all the letters look like chicken scratch. Now you're telling me there's no vowels? But as Hebrew became less and less known, kind of like Latin to us, everybody used to speak, at least scholars used to all know Latin, and now most people don't speak Latin. As Hebrew became more and more of an arcane language, there was a group of Jewish rabbis called the Masoretes who said, we better go through here and add the vowels so people can remember how to pronounce these words. And they went through and they put all these little dots and dashes to tell people where the vowels go. Anyway, all that to say, that's why for a long time we thought the word was pronounced Jehovah, but it's not. It's probably better pronounced Yahweh. Yahweh. So every time you see L-O-R-D in caps, that's what it is. It's Yahweh, which is the name of God. There the angel of Yahweh appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I'm going to go over and see this strange sight, why the bush doesn't burn up. When Yahweh saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. Don't come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground." Then he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." These names from 400 plus years ago. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Then Yahweh said, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I've come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I've seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now, go, I am sending you. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. I'm sending you." And now begins the arguing between Moses and God. The excuses. All the reasons Moses says, "You got the wrong guy." Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" Like, what do you mean you're sending me? Who am I to do that? I mean, implying God of our fathers, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. Do you not know my story? Do you not know that I fled Egypt after killing an Egyptian, and the Pharaoh was going to kill me? And I mean, do you not know, God, how I ended up here in this desert in front of this bush? Watching my father-in-law's sheep? And God said, verse 12, "I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who've sent you. When you've brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain, on this Mount Horeb." Moses said, "Well, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you.' And they ask me, 'What's his name?' Then what shall I tell them? If I just walk back into, 'The God of our fathers has sent me to lead us all out of slavery,' like, what God? What are you talking about? Who's this God? What's his name?" And God said to Moses, "I am who I am," which is another form of that same name, Yahweh. Because the name Yahweh really means He who is. The name of God is He who is. In other words, God is the one who is. I mean, when we talk about God is before everything, above everything, eternal. He is the one who is. And he says, "I am that I am." His name basically means I am. Tell them, "I am has sent you to me." God said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation. Go, assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, appeared to me and said, I've watched over you and have seen what's been done to you in Egypt, and I've promised to bring you out of your misery in Egypt and into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. The elders of Israel will listen to you. Then you and the elders are to go to the king of Egypt and say to him, Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us take a 3-day journey into the desert to offer sacrifices to Yahweh our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. So I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I will perform among them. And after that, he will let you go. And I will make the Egyptians favorably disposed towards this people, so that when you leave, you won't go empty-handed. Every woman is to ask her neighbor and any woman living in her house for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, which she will put on your sons and daughters. And so you will plunder the Egyptians. Now, just as a sidelight, sometimes Christianese, little phrases that we Christians use in context from borrowing a phrase from the Bible and using it in something. Has anyone ever heard that phrase, plunder the Egyptians, in another context, in another way, and as an expression? A little bit, but a little more specific even than that. Here's what I have heard it used, and it's not a phrase that I use because I think it's pretty obscure, but I've heard it used this way, and this may be not current anymore, but the idea of plunder the Egyptians was the idea that we, being the children of Abraham, the church of Jesus, sometimes we would use a secular product to further the kingdom of God. We would use something which the secular culture has produced, but use it for a godly purpose. This was used a lot. I'll tell you when I heard it used, and this is even a little bit before my time. Back when Christian rock was a new thing, okay, in the 70s, when there first used to be guitars and drums in churches. That wasn't a thing until the 70s. Then it was still pretty rare. And there were people, especially more conservative Christians, who said, that's the devil's music, Anything with a guitar and a drum, that's the devil's music. And the answer was, we are going to plunder the Egyptians. In other words, we're going to take rock and roll and use it for the kingdom. We're going to take this style of music that you say is the devil's music, but we're going to use it for God. So that was where they'd used the phrase, plunder the Egyptians. Anyway, I've rarely heard it in the last maybe 20 years. But that's, when I see that phrase, plunder the Egyptians, I know that in Christianese, sometimes that's how that phrase has been used. But the idea is, when they do leave Egypt, and we haven't gotten there yet, but when they do leave Egypt, he says, make sure you take your Egyptian masters are going to be finally so relieved to get rid of you because of everything they're going to be put through with all these plagues that are going to happen. They're going to go, here, just go. Here, take my earring. Take my bracelet. Just go. And you say, well, why is that important? Because that gold is going to be used later on for something not good. What is that gold going to be used for later on? To make a golden calf. That gold, when it says, make sure the Egyptians give you the gold and silver earrings and things like that. Later on in the story, I know, spoiler alert, but later on in the story, where did they get this gold to make this golden calf? They're a bunch of slaves. That's where the gold comes from. So just a little bit more. I got about 6 or 7 minutes. I think we'll just get one more of Moses' objections. Chapter 4. Moses said, what if they don't believe me? Which is a pretty valid question. And listen to me and say, Yahweh didn't appear to you, which is a pretty valid question. Because here's a guy that ran off. He comes back, he's meeting with all the elders of Israel, and he's like, you're not going to believe this. I'm out in Midian. There's a bush. It's on fire, but it's not burned up. And then the God of our forefathers spoke to me from the bush and said that I'm supposed to come back and get us all out of slavery and get us all out of Egypt. And he's like, what if they don't believe me? Because that would be a pretty high possibility that they wouldn't believe him. Because would you believe somebody who said that? See, there was this talking bush. And he's like, what if they don't believe me? Which is a pretty high probability that is exactly what they'll say. Because, I sometimes think when we read the Bible and we read about ancient people, we think that they were like naive or easily duped, or, if somebody told them something that they would just, okay, especially something supernatural or something, if they said, well, an angel appeared to me and told me I need to go do this, that's why when Mary goes to Joseph, her husband in the New Testament, and says, an angel told me I'm going to get pregnant, but not through a man, but, blah, blah. Joseph yeah, I'm divorcing you. Because people in an earlier time they weren't dense, they weren't foolish. They were not easily going to believe something that seemed impossible. They were skeptical just like we would be skeptical, And so it's not a surprise when people don't believe something in the Bible, because they're not that different from us. To believe something fantastic, they're going to need some sort of sign or proof. So he says, well, what if they don't believe me? God didn't appear to you. And so here's the answer God gives him. Verse 4:2. Yahweh said to him, what's that in your hand? A staff. He's a shepherd. Throw it on the ground. Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake. And he ran from it. Then Yahweh said to him, reach out your hand and take it by the tail. Yeah, right. So Moses reached out and took hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff. This, said the Lord, is so that they may believe that Yahweh, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Then the Lord said, put your hand inside your cloak. Moses put his hand into his cloak. And when he came out, it was leprous, like snow. It was all white, full of leprosy. Now put it back into your cloak, he said. Moses put his hand back into his cloak, and when he took it out, it was restored, like the rest of his flesh. The Lord said, if they don't believe you or pay attention to the first miraculous sign, they may believe the second. But if they don't believe the two signs or listen to you, take some water from the Nile and pour it out on the dry ground. The water you take from the river will become blood on the ground. So he gives him 3 miracles, basically. You can turn your staff into a snake and then turn it back into a stick again. You can make your hand be full of leprosy, and then the leprosy is gone, and you can turn water into blood. If they say, oh, God didn't appear to you, well, look at this. And you can perform these signs like, you can't, that's not normal. Turn sticks into snakes. That's not normal. And so he's like, here's how you can convince them that you really did hear from me, and this is all real. And I'll end with this, verse 10. Moses said to the Lord, O Lord, I've never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you've been spoken to your servant. I'm slow of speech and tongue. In other words, no, please, no, I don't want to do this. And we're going to see, well, I'll finish this paragraph while we're at it. I guess I got 2 minutes, okay. Please, he says, I'm not a good speaker. I'm slow of tongue. I'm not eloquent. I'm not going to make a speech or go to make demands of Pharaoh. The Lord said to him, who gave man his mouth? Who makes him deaf or mute? Who gives him sight or makes him blind? Is it not I, Yahweh? Now go. I'll help you speak and I'll teach you what to say. But Moses said, oh, Lord, please send someone else to do it. Please send someone else. So Moses is not anxious to accept this assignment. If you count up, he gives 5 different reasons. He tries to say no to God 5 times. And yet God is not going to take no for an answer. And so we're going to find out when God is unwilling to take no for an answer. We'll see when Moses finally is like, well, okay, I guess you're not taking no for an answer. I guess I'm doing it. And so Moses is a reluctant messenger. And of course, we're going to see that God knows what he's doing. He is the right person for the job. And Moses of course, becomes the most revered person in the Old Testament. I mean, Moses is lifted up as the greatest servant of God in the Old Testament. And that's why this book is so crucial to the identity of Israel and the identity of the Jewish people and the identity of really not just Judaism, but Christianity as well. And why Moses plays such a crucial part in this event that defines in many ways Israel and defines the children of Abraham. So that's why this book is one that I love so much, and it's not always easy reading, and it's not always, but it's definitely a fascinating story, and that's why it's been made into movies and TV shows and cartoons and everything else, because it is a great story. It is a great story of how God delivers an oppressed people out of oppression and into freedom. And I think that's why it's a universal story, is because most of us can relate to the idea of an oppressed people being set free, because in the history of the world, that story is replayed over and over and over. That idea of the yearning for freedom, the evil oppressor, the freedom fighter, all that is a story that's told and retold and retold. So I apologize for our late start, and I apologize if you're watching this later because we had to tape it instead of live stream it. Sorry, we'll try to get that figured out for next week. Let's pray. Lord, we're grateful for this story that reminds us of your power, of your calling, of how you hear our cries and respond. Lord, a lot of it is mystery to us. Some of it is beyond our ability to fully understand, and yet we see in it this essential human desire for freedom. And we see how you set captives free and release people from bondage. And Lord, you are in the business of doing that even today, whether it's bondage to sin or bondage to death or bondage to addictions or whatever bondage people are still struggling with, that you set us free. And we ask that you be with us this day and every day.